address them at the end.
Hello, everyone.
All right, so we're going to get right into it. I'm going to share my screen here. We have a little presentation for you, and we'll get going. Obviously, as Megan mentioned, any questions that come up, happy to answer at the end. Hopefully, we'll have about 10 minutes or so after we stop talking to get to some of your questions. So here we go. All right, thinking ahead. Can everyone see that? I think that's showing up just fine. Thinking ahead, addressing the challenges of long-term rentals. So I think as most rental companies did this past year, we ended up feeling like we had to pivot pretty hard away from what we normally do, and we're mainly focused on high-end weddings, milestone parties, those types of things, towards something else. And this presentation is born from just some of the challenges that we came up against when we were starting to pivot into these longer-term rentals, and some of the ideas that we came up with and Warren came up with regarding how do we address those challenges and how do we make things smoother for future rentals. So like everything, we start with the quoting process, which ends up being similar to what we usually encountered, although we felt like the clients were actually a little bit less informed than they usually are. So a lot of times when we end up speaking with clients over the phone, they give us a call, they say, hey, we want to rent a tent. It's really an education process from that point. So a lot of people don't understand the ins and outs of these tents, and they don't understand what's possible and what isn't. So we remind our salespeople. Most people that call in, they don't understand what they're really asking for. They don't understand that a lot more goes into it than just putting a tent on their patio and walking away. So everybody gets the questions. My space is 30 by 30. We need coverage. We're a restaurant. Our indoor space is limited. What can you do for us? What do you have in that size range? So at that point, we go into well, we have sizes like that. We have plenty of inventory in that range. Let's try and get out for a site visit. Tell me a little bit about what you're thinking. We found open-ended conversations are the best for getting the maximum amount of information from the very beginning. And we try to engage up front as much as we can so that we get as much information, because that allows us to do our job a little bit better. So what we're really trying to do during these initial phone calls is get down, what do they really need? If they measure their space out and the measurements are accurate, more than likely we have a size that will work for them. What we ended up coming up against, and this is something we also talked to our salespeople about, what we ended up coming up against was they would call in, they would say, we want a 20 by 30, that's what our space is. We may have been sold out of 20 by 30 or 20 by 40 or whatever, 20 wide in general. If they can make a different size work, we ask them that question. You know, we have a lot of inventory in 18 wide. Based on the layout that you want to put in the tent, will that work for you? Because then we can sell you the job. But those were all questions that we had to ask in the initial phone call. Again, the more information we could get from the client right up front, the better, and then we could move on to the site review. The other question we got when we initially started working through some of these inquiries and people started calling in, people who normally had not rented tents before. And we actually got this question a lot from restaurant groups who had backers or had been around for a long time, so potentially had a little bit more money, a little bit deeper pockets. We would send them a quote for 3 months, maybe with another 3-month extension option, and they would see the numbers and they would say, well, how much is it to buy this inventory? This is a lot of money. What, you know, can I buy it, and can I then have it in my inventory as an asset? And again, it was an education process. We love to entertain that idea. It was a good way for us. We did it quite a bit actually, and it was a good way for us to kind of move out of some of our older inventory into maybe some new product that we liked, maybe a little bit more than our initial buys. So we would talk to them about life expectancy. We would talk to them about replacement costs. If a top got to a point where it wasn't acceptable for their standard of service. And we would also ask for a multi-year service contract. This turned out to be a great thing that we were able to do. multi-year service contracts for anything that they buy. We were able to give them a quote up front with the equipment, obviously, and then we would send also along with it, we would send a service contract that had the yearly cost to install and remove. We told everybody, we said that setting these tents up, we were doing some Navitrack, we were doing some F3. Setting these tents up is a lot more involved than a normal, than a restaurant worker or a maintenance man would be able to take on most likely. So we said, let our team come in, install the tent when you need it. Here's a cost for that based on our hourly rates. And then let our team, when you're done with the tent, remove it after the fact. And here's a cost for that. We also put in there storm removals. We had a couple of storms blow through that were 50 and 60 miles an hour in Connecticut. We had some tents that were close to water, not directly on, but close. We also had a storm come in December that dropped 12 inches, 18 inches, depending on where they were in the state. So in those instances, the client wanted to know up front, and we wanted to educate them up front and say, hey, if we're expecting a storm or we feel like this tent is not going to withstand either the winds or the snow or whatever, then we're gonna take initiative to come out and remove the tent tops and let the storm pass and then put them back on afterwards so that the tent remains safe. And if you're buying the tent, you really don't want a situation where this thing is gonna collapse because there's 12 inches of snow on the tops. And you also probably don't have the money to pay for a tent that's snow rated. So we ended up including those costs in the service contract up front. And that was, and the clients appreciate that kind of transparency, and they appreciate the foresight so that they know that if something comes up, they know what their expenses are gonna be versus having a surprise charge later on. The other thing we've been able to leverage with these service contracts is a yearly cleaning. You know, we'll tell the clients we have a wash facility in our warehouse. If the tent is up 3, 6, 9 months, then it's going to get grimy. It's just the way it is. We can clean it for you. Here's the charge, and you can let us know at the end of each rental if you want to do that or not. We'll send you pictures. We'll send you our recommendation. But it keeps our warehouse guys working. A lot of times what we've seen in the past is that they were taking down these tents in the wintertime when things were slower, and we could utilize our labor to clean these things and make a little bit of profit in that regard. The last charge that we put in quite a bit was a warehousing fee. We all pay rent or we pay a mortgage, and this is taking up space in our warehouse. This is something that is not huge, but it is something of service that we're providing. So we wanted to be certain that we could charge accordingly for that because it's something that we were providing. We also wanted to be very upfront about the weather. Obviously, we included that in the storm removal and reinstallation charges if people wanted to buy the inventory. But we sent them information saying if winds are forecast above this rate, then people shouldn't be under there. If there's snow forecast above a certain accumulation, people should not be under there. And people generally like clear vinyl for walls. A lot of restaurants like that look. They don't want to feel closed in. Here are the problems with clear vinyl. When it gets below a certain temperature, or when you get a certain amount of wind or whatever else, it can crack, the weld can fail. Here's a replacement cost for either a top or a wall in that regard. So we'll move on to the next slide. Warren was going to take this one. I'm not sure with this, and then he can pop in when he comes back on. So equipment selection, another big thing. As we start to get more and more calls for long-term rentals, you know, we all know kind of what our equipment choices are for the weekend wedding or the or the weekend backyard event. Long-term, we view it as we want to give them the sturdiest possible piece of equipment, knowing that it could be subject to more wear and tear than it would normally be on a weekend. The other thing that we came across a lot of was the wind and snow certifications, particularly. Usually we're used to dealing with wind certifications and engineering and meeting the code for that. Connecticut is fairly strict on that. Snow was a big thing that we hadn't come up against a lot because a lot of our tents were up and down in the wintertime. And we had the misfortune of having the state building inspector come out with a mandate saying any tents installed after, I believe it was November 15th, needed to meet local snow load ratings, which in our neck of the woods usually was about 30 pounds per square foot. Not a lot of tents in the market can do that. So we ended up, we'll actually get to this in another slide, dealing with code officials, but all these factors were taken into consideration when we were putting out these tents. Another big question, we touched on it earlier, clear tops and walls. Will the tent be exposed to temperatures below 30 degrees? That's the number that we put out there. Will it be exposed to high winds? And then question for the client right up front. Okay, you want clear walls, you want clear tops. In our contract, it states that the client is responsible if equipment fails when it's in their use, or rather, if a piece of clear fails, the client is responsible if we've advised them not to do it because of the weather, or because it's going to be exposed to cold temperatures, high winds. Those are the conversations again we were having up front with the clients so that they weren't upset with us later on if we had to go back and bill them. How will the tent be secured? This question is getting asked, rightfully so, more and more. I think the advent of new ways to anchor tents, and also some building officials being more stringent with how things are secured. We're thinking about that too now that we're putting tents on patios for a long time, testing pull-out strength of stakes. What formula are you using for weight requirements? Some guys are doing 10 pounds a square foot, some guys are doing 15. We made all those calculations, and every building department that we went to, they were asking, so how are you weighting this thing down? What's the formula you're using? So we had to be very clear on that. Again, we were upfront with the clients as much as we could be, and again, this was a learning process, but as much as we could be, we were upfront with them about the weather limitations for each piece of equipment that they were going to get from us. So we wanted to be upfront. Move on to the next slide. Code officials, everybody's favorite. I think there's another town hall about this, or another meeting about this a little bit later on in the seminar. Contact town hall before sending a quote. We knew a lot of these building departments that we were going to be working in for these long-term rentals. What we didn't know was how they were going to react if somebody came to them and said, we want a tent up during the winter months for 3 to 6 months, depending on how things go with COVID. So we were trying to get ahead of those conversations as much as we could. Like I said, things were a little bit, a little bit of a wrench got thrown in the works when the state building officials said that every tent that was installed after November 15th had to be snow rated. Many times we were able to talk with building officials in the local towns and develop a plan for them. If snow was forecast over a certain amount or over a certain rate, then we would be on site clearing snow, or we would take off the tops, or we would do one of a number of different things. I mean, I think it was a full page of a snow response plan that we submitted with each of these permits whenever it was required by the town. So finding out, what do they need to see up front? Do they need to see wind certifications? Do they need to see snow load certifications? Do they want to see the full engineering book, or do they just want a drawing saying that it's certified to a certain amount with a stamp on it? Those are all questions to ask up front. And then again, if the requirements are unrealistic for the end user, it's about having a conversation with these code officials and getting back to the fact that we all want this to be a safe install. We don't want anybody to get hurt under one of our tents. We don't want anything to come back on the code official as the authority in the jurisdiction. So we always brought it back to, this is what we think is safe. Here's why we think this is safe. Can we submit something signed? Here's what we need to do if there's high winds or heavy snow. The other thing they like to see, and it's actually, I believe it's becoming more and more of a requirement by OSHA, but there's an evacuation plan. If something happens where the tent begins to fail, or if there's something happens where there's a weather event that causes the tent to become unsafe, Where are people going if they're in the tent to get out of the tent? Another tent is not the right answer. It should be a building, it should be their car, it should be something other than another temporary structure. So we submitted those to building officials, and they seem to placate a lot of their concerns. Part of that evacuation plan was often who monitors the weather. Is it someone at the property, whether it's a restaurant manager, or we did some houses of worship. Is it someone there that's going to be on site whenever someone is at the venue? We installed weather monitoring systems so they could see what the wind speed was on these tents. That's something that some towns in Connecticut began to require, but I think more and more it's becoming just good standard practice, just so we can monitor exactly what's happening at each tent site. And then one thing to consider too with code officials, when you're pulling permits for these tents, temporary structure permits last for 180 days. So if the end user wants to extend the rental beyond that, you're gonna have to pull another permit. You may need to remove and reinstall depending on how strict the code official is regarding those temporary structure permits. So, servicing costs. This was a big unknown for us as we were heading into these rentals. We knew that there were going to be some calls. We did our best to try and button these jobs up as much as we could, but inevitably things come up and the end user wants to adjust this, or the big thing, if you have heaters there, sometimes the heater isn't kicking on or isn't firing. So how did we address service charges? So we tried to be as upfront as possible. So on each of our estimates that went out, we ended up putting on there all service calls billed at this rate. What we ended up doing was taking an assistant foreman rate, who would usually be going out to take care of some of these calls because they're a little bit less involved usually, and we multiply it by 3. And why do we do that? We want to get a little bit of profit out of it. We want to make sure we're covering payroll expenses, payroll taxes, which are above and beyond their hourly rate. And we also want to cover travel, vehicle gas, whatever it is. So they're getting billed at a certain hourly rate from the time they leave the warehouse until the time they get back to the warehouse after the service call is done. And again, all upfront with the client. We think, and I think this was proven right, that the client wants to know all these charges up front, even if it seems excessive to them up front, but at least they don't have to get hit on the back end with charges that they weren't expecting. Another thing that we ended up building in after we had a bunch of these jobs out, we built in a cost for a weekly check-in. And what that meant was we had a small team, and we were fortunate actually that we had a number of jobs that were in a relatively small area. We had a small team go out. A lot of these were restaurant jobs, and we had a small team go out Friday afternoon before the restaurant opened up for the weekend, and they would check it. They would check straps, they would check propane levels, they would check heater functionality, they would check walls, make sure there's no tears, rips, everything was fastened in to the sills. And that eliminated a lot of calls over the weekends. A lot of times these restaurants open up, they begin their service, and they notice that one of the heaters isn't kicking on, and they call us, and they have either a project manager number or my number sometimes, and we'd be getting calls at 5:30 on a Saturday night after service opened up at these restaurants. We thought better to just get ahead of it, build it into the cost, and then we don't have to worry, we don't have to get bothered over the weekend with something that could have been taken care of the day before when we had guys on staff on payroll. We ended up also designating one or two of our crew leaders or assistant crew leaders to be on call, and we ended up paying them a stipend basically, and saying you need to be on call, you need to be available for us should something come up at one of these sites, and if it doesn't end up, if you don't end up being called to something, then it's just extra money in your pocket. But a little bit extra, a couple $100, and they were these screw leaders were very much willing to just be available, be by their phone, and we were able to take care of a lot of things as things came up, just having someone on call 30 minutes away from wherever these sites were. And then the last consideration was educating the client at the install and saying, this is how the heater works. We put a sticker on top of the heaters with the instructions, with some troubleshooting on there, all-weather sticker, so they can see it. It's right in front of them. We ended up showing where everything was plugged in. So we would get calls sometimes, everyone does. You know, someone's kicked out an outlet or a wire from an outlet. And so this is where everything's plugged in. Check this to make sure it's still plugged in. Here's the heater. Here's the high limit resets on the heater. Do all these things before you give us a call, because you'll be able to take care of things much more quickly usually than having one of our guys come out and look at it. So I think we got Warren back. Warren, do you want to take the last two?
Warren, it looks like you might be muted on your end or something.
Do you have me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Warren.
Good. Finally, technology is wonderful, isn't it? Basically, with heating and cooling, the most conventional means of heating and cooling in the industry is enclosing the tent fully with, sidewalls and doors. And typically using a propane or either some type of a diesel fuel fired heater, that the heater is outside of the tent, and then electrically you're blowing the air in through diffusers under the tent with thermostats. That's the most conventional use of heat we do. Unfortunately, there are scenarios with COVID that we found where our clients do not want to have a tent that is completely enclosed. They want to have ventilation. So we do not want to have sidewalls completely enclosed in the tent. We may want to only have sidewalls on one side or one end just to block a draft from under the tent. And then this relegates us to using some type of radiant heat versus forced air heat, where we're heating a space. Two different ways of the radiant heat is with electric infrared or either propane infrared heat. Some code officials may prohibit the use of propane, thus requiring you to use the electric form of this heat. One thing to consider with electric heat is the power requirements. The amp draw for electric heat is going to be quite significant. So you may have to factor in a generator. When you factor in the generator now, you're also factoring in the hours of runtime on the generator, refuel in the generator, and service charges related to that as well. Once again, we must educate the client on all of the potential charges, all the fuel costs that they may incur up front, including the potential fuel consumption, the cost of operating per hour, as well as any delivery fees and drop fees and service fees for maintaining the heat in the AC or AC respectively, throughout the potential term of the rental. Always have a clear quote up front with your client so that there are no surprises at the 11th hour, and everyone is 100% transparent in the process. I guess we can flip over to the next slide. Finally, one of the last things that we're dealing with here is the pricing structure. In our industry, there are so many variables on how we price our long-term installs. Probably the most widely accepted industry standard for pricing would be to take the standard weekly rate and multiply it by 2.5 times to come up with a 4-week rate. the idea is that your first week's rental is going to cover your labor of installation and then removal of the tent. And then each additional week that the tent or the equipment is there, you're getting a half of a rental, which then that covers your asset cost and your profit for your assets for the balance of those 4-week period. Another thing to do is always consider whatever the depreciation may potentially be of your assets. We're dealing with extended environmental exposures. What condition is your tent, your vinyl going to be in when it comes back after a long-term rental? Is it going to still be the grade that you would like it to be, or is it going to need to be replaced even when it comes back? Always take this into consideration and adjust your pricing for the rental relative to a good cost analysis of what the true wear and tear of the equipment is going to be while out on rent. Another thing is that if the unfortunate situation arises where the equipment is damaged while on rent by your client, if it's weather related or vandalism or whatever the circumstance may be, all of these potential situations need to be addressed up front. Make sure that your contract has you covered in any imaginable scenario that may present itself. Last thing we want to do is get into that awkward situation with insurance and so forth, where we end up losing on the back end of it because we haven't done our due diligence with our contract. In closing, one of the things to get back to pricing that we have found that works pretty well is we take the normal weekly rental rate and then we multiply it out times 4 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever the period is. And we show the client what the total rental would be on a weekly rate. Then we come in and apply a discount relative to our cost analysis that will then show them what their actual cost will be. Clients tend to love to see discounts, and when they can see a large number with a big cost and then see a 35 or 40% discount and they can see exactly how much they're saving, a lot of times that'll get you the job against your competition if you're pricing against competition. And that way we know we've covered all the bases, and the client hopefully feels good about the price they've been quoted. Anything else to add, Zach?
You both. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions right now. So if you do have any questions, please make sure that you find Zach and Warren at the tables during today's breaks. Otherwise, I'm going to pass things back to Jill.